The air inside the Whitcomb warehouse was stagnant, heavy with the cloying scent of fermenting fruit and trapped heat. A worker moved through the aisles, his lantern casting long, flickering shadows against stacks of crates. Then, it happened. A sharp, metallic pop. Then another, and a third. Beneath the heavy metal bands, jar lids began to warp and buckle, forced open by the violent expansion of gases within. The warehouse was dying, one jar at a time. Miles away, hidden beneath the earth, the silence was absolute. Eli wiped sweat from his brow, carefully recording a steady temperature in a small, weathered notebook. Clara moved along the rows of glass, her fingers tracing the rubber seals, verifying every vacuum lock. Pearl, her white cat, slept soundly on the cool sandstone floor. Down here there were no pops, only the steady, stubborn endurance of a system that refused to surrender. But months earlier, the valley had watched Clara lay her last $4 on 7 crates of bruised, rejected peaches. Silas Whitcomb had laughed, calling it a fool's errand. Clara didn't argue. She simply pulled a knife, sliced into a single, battered fruit, and revealed the perfect gold beneath. How does a woman who couldn't afford to patch her own roof build a sanctuary that outlasts the largest storehouse in the valley? In this story of survival, the answer lies in what we choose to save and what we learn to throw away. In the late summer of 1888, Cottonwood Bend felt like a held breath. The irrigation ditches, usually the lifeline of the valley, were receding into cracked, thirsty mud. The wooden fence rails, bleached white by an unrelenting sun, began to splinter with audible cracks. Mornings that once brought a crisp breeze now arrived with a stifling stillness. And even after the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the earth refused to release the day's heat. Clara sat on her porch, watching the water line in her makeshift rain barrel drop by another inch. She opened her notebook, the one with the frayed edges, and marked the depletion. She didn't need a thermometer to know the valley was running out of time. For the families of Cottonwood Bend, this harvest was not a luxury. It was the margin between life and a freezing winter. The general store's shelves were already thinning. Sugar was a memory, and the flour sacks were light. A successful peach harvest meant more than just fruit. It meant the currency to trade for flour, lard, and fuel. To lose the crop was to lose the very insulation of their lives against the coming frost. Then, the wind arrived. It did not bring rain. Instead, a wall of superheated air roared out of Redstone Canyon, carrying sand and gravel like buckshot. It slammed into the orchards with the force of a physical blow. Branches whipped violently until they snapped. Hundreds of ripening peaches were torn from the boughs, raining down into the dry dirt. It lasted barely 15 minutes, but the damage was absolute. By afternoon, Silas Whitcomb was walking the rows of his orchard, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He was a man of cold, hard logic, and his assessment was swift. He bought the unblemished fruit at a lowered rate, his ledger open and his fountain pen dry. When it came to the bruised and split peaches, those leaking juice into the soil, he turned his back. "I won't risk my warehouse on fruit that's already dying," he said, and no one could argue. He was the only buyer for 50 miles, and his logic was as sound as the ground was dry. As the sun began to set, the other growers packed their wagons and retreated. Clara didn't move. She stood alone in the silence, staring at the discarded piles. She took a step toward the 7 crates of fruit everyone else had deemed worthless. Clara stared at the discarded peaches, then at the small canvas bag tucked into her apron. Inside sat $4.25, the sum she had scrimped together for cedar shingles. The leaks in her roof had grown during the last spring thaw, and she had promised herself that this time she would stop the water. If she used this money to buy the fruit, she knew the bucket in the middle of her kitchen would be her only companion through the winter rains. She looked up at the darkening sky, then at the harvest wasting away. She made her choice. She approached the crates, not as a desperate scavenger, but as a technician. She didn't buy the heap, she bought potential. Picking up each fruit, she applied a brutal logic. If a peach smelled of fermentation, it went to the compost. If it leaked around the stem, it was discarded. Peaches with firm flesh but a single bruise were set aside for immediate trimming, while those too soft were designated for the kettle that very hour. Every decision was a calculated defense against spoilage. A shadow fell over the crate. A boy, perhaps 13, stood nearby. He wore an oversized hat that swallowed his features, and his boots, one a rugged leather work boot, the other a worn-out lace-up, did not match. He didn't beg. Instead, he reached for a heavy crate. Clara braced for the sound of squashing fruit, but he moved with unnatural grace, sliding his arms beneath the bottom and steadying the weight before it touched her cart. Not a single peach shifted. Pearl, her white cat, trotted over to inspect a fallen peach. The cat sniffed the fermenting skin, recoiled, and retreated toward the shade. Clara pointed to the fruit, her voice steady. "Don't keep something that can sicken others just because you regret the price you paid," she said. It was more than a lesson in canning. It was her life's mandate. As they hauled the load home, Clara noticed the boy placed his mismatched boots facing the door. He was always ready to bolt, yet he stayed to help. She didn't ask his name or his history. She simply handed him a sharp, worn knife, trusting his hands before his words. Inside the cabin, the silence of 2 years lingered like dust. Clara stood before the cupboard, her fingers grazing the rim of a ceramic cup, one of 2 identical ones Nate had brought from the railhead. Next to it sat the heavy copper kettle, its handle still bearing the amateurish but sturdy patch Nate had riveted into place before the summer fever of 1886 took him. She reached for the kettle, then hesitated, her hand hovering over a rusted chisel resting on the shelf. She pulled back, turning instead to the hearth. She struck a match, and for the first time since his death, a fire roared beneath the iron grate. Memories flickered like the flames. The frantic heat of that final summer, the cooling cloths, the stillness of a man who would never lift a tool again. She pushed the grief aside. There was no room for ghosts when peaches were rotting. She and Eli began the work. They scrubbed the jars, but Clara's eye caught a jagged, microscopic chip on the rim of one, a death trap for a vacuum seal. She discarded it. They wrestled with rubber rings that had hardened in the shed's heat, struggling to stretch them over the glass threads. In her haste to save the bounty, Clara made the mistake of treating large quart jars and small pint jars with the same processing time, and she kept a few peaches that looked good enough, fearing the waste. When the boiling water bath finally stopped, Eli tied a white string around the neck of the first successful jar. He watched with bated breath as the metal lid pulled inward with a faint, reassuring click. He grinned, but Clara simply marked the time in the ledger, her expression unreadable. 3 days later, the illusion of perfection shattered. A ring of dried syrup had crusted beneath a metal band, and the lid sat at a sickening, uneven angle. Clara didn't hesitate to taste or salvage. She carried the offending jar to the porch, her face hardening. She isolated the entire batch, refusing to let a single one stay in the pantry. She wrapped the faulty jar in a cloth, grabbed her coat, and set off toward the home of Ruth Pomeroy. Ruth Pomeroy didn't taste the failed peach or offer immediate sympathy. She simply sat Clara down at her heavy oak table and opened a ledger. "Start from the beginning," Ruth commanded. She meticulously cross-examined every step: who had prepped the fruit, who wiped the rims, how the rubber rings were inspected, and exactly where the jars had been staged while cooling. As Clara recounted the process, Ruth didn't find a single mistake. She found a cascade of them. The jar size hadn't matched the processing time, and the rings had been reused without being tested for elasticity. The toll of the failure was heavy. The sugar was gone, the woodpile was noticeably diminished, and 3 days of back-breaking labor had produced nothing but waste. Yet Clara didn't try to hide the failure or salvage the questionable jars. She ordered the entire batch tossed into the compost pit. The loss was painful, but the alternative, a hidden hazard waiting to strike a neighbor, was a price she refused to pay. Mom at the cabin, a new system emerged. Clara introduced a color-coded hierarchy: green string for perfectly stable batches, yellow for softer fruit intended only for immediate local sale, and red for experimental or isolated jars. She inaugurated a batch ledger, a dense grid detailing the source of the fruit, the names of the preparers, the size of the glass, the shelf position, and the date of each follow-up inspection. They implemented a rigorous cross-check system. One person prepared the fruit, while another performed the final rim wipe and seal check. No jar was allowed to leave the cabin unless they could account for every variable. When Anna, a neighbor hired to help, tried to cut too close to a bruise to maximize the yield, Clara stopped her hand. She held up the slice and asked, "If this were a jar meant for your own daughter in the middle of January, how much would you trim?" Without another word, Anna took the knife and cut a wider, safer margin. Days later, the first green string batch emerged from the water bath. Not a single seal failed. The ledger was complete, and every variable was accounted for. Ruth Pomeroy arrived to inspect the result. She didn't praise the sweetness or the color of the fruit. She simply set the ledger down and looked Clara in the eye. "Now," Ruth said, "you finally have a method." Clara realized then that an error recorded was knowledge gained, while an error hidden was merely a debt waiting to be paid by someone else. With a refined method, Clara brought her first green string jars to the general store. Martha, the proprietor, didn't offer empty pleasantries. She opened a jar, tasted one spoonful, and fell silent. She paused, then reached for a clean spoon to take a second taste, analyzing the clarity of the syrup and the texture of the fruit. Without a word, she lined up 6 jars on the front windowsill. Word spread quickly. A family that had lost their entire orchard during the canyon wind bought 2, intending to stretch them through the leanest months of winter. A weary stagecoach driver purchased one, trading his spare change for a rare bit of nourishment. To these people, the golden slices were not merely a treat, they were a hedge against the inevitable hunger of the cold months ahead. Clara managed the inflow of coins with surgical precision. The money didn't go toward patching her roof. Not yet. She prioritized replenishing rubber rings, sugar, and well-earned wages for Eli and Anna. Only after the operation was secured did she set aside a fraction for the original peach grower and the long-delayed roof repairs. Her triumph, however, was tempered by Dr. Caldwell. He inspected the jars on the windowsill, his brow furrowing as he felt the glass through the afternoon sun. "A vacuum seal is only a temporary wall, Clara," he warned. "Your kitchen is an oven. Constant lingering heat will degrade the fruit's integrity, even if the lid stays tight. Well, you haven't considered where these will survive the remainder of the summer." Before she could dwell on his warning, a soft scratching caught their attention. Pearl, the white cat, had vanished. Eli tracked her to the north side of the cabin, where the ground sloped sharply downward. He found the cat huddled inside an abandoned shaded hollow. As Clara leaned in, the air hit her skin, sharp, cool, and damp. She brushed away a layer of moss to reveal the weathered, rhythmic chisel marks of Nate's hand. The foundation for her solution had been waiting in the dark all along. Before a single shovel of earth was turned, Clara and Eli spent an entire day as observers. They mapped the sun's path, traced the prevailing breeze, identified the natural dampness of the soil, and marked where heavy rains would inevitably wash down the slope. They recorded the temperature differential between the surface and the hollow. Only when the land had revealed its temperament did they begin to design. They understood the cardinal rule of survival. You do not impose your will on the terrain. You negotiate with it. The plan was a study in convection. The cellar would be sunken deep, its entrance facing away from the brutal afternoon sun. An intake vent would draw cool air low across the floor, while an outlet would exhaust rising heat through the ceiling. They designed the shelves to sit away from the sandstone walls to prevent rot, and the floor was graded to funnel water into a drainage trench lined with gravel. A willow and grass roof provided shade, held at a distance from the cellar walls to allow the structure to breathe. Materials arrived through rigorous trade. Samuel, a neighbor, delivered sandstone in exchange for a documented share of the coming autumn sales. Clara refused all charity, balancing every ledger entry. Eli was handed Nate's rusted chisel. Clara guided his hands, showing him how to keep the angle steady, teaching him that the tool does the work if the pressure is true. The first trial of their system was a humbling failure. They lit a strip of cloth to test the draft, but the smoke hung motionless in the air. The outlet vent was too low. They raised it 3 feet, but the wind immediately forced the smoke backward. choking the cellar. It took hours of adjusting the aperture, fine-tuning the hood, and remeasuring the angle before the plume finally pulled upward. Then came the water test. They poured buckets along the exterior to simulate a flash storm, only to watch a muddy trickle invade the corner. Eli discovered a slight dip in the grade. They spent the next 2 hours hauling stones to redirect the path of the water before a single jar was brought inside. They placed 3 thermometers, one in the sweltering kitchen, one in the dry woodshed, and one inside the new cellar. 2 identical jars from the same batch were set in the kitchen and the cellar as a control. Conflict arose as the summer heat peaked. To keep the cellar's burlap curtains damp, Eli moved to use their dwindling supply of drinking water. Clara stopped his hand. "Survival is not wasting tomorrow to save today," she said. Instead, they deepened the exterior shade, reused wash water for the curtains, and restricted cellar access to the cool hours of dawn. After 7 days, the cellar's temperature remained markedly more stable than the shed. Yet, as Eli hovered, waiting for a word of victory, Clara simply opened her ledger and wrote, "1 week. Not enough." Survival was rarely a moment of heroic triumph. It was the quiet, grinding discipline of measuring the wall a 3rd time, because the first 2 tries simply hadn't been reliable enough. Clara's first trial shipment, 6 jars meticulously packed by Frank the driver, was a silent success. She included her ledger notes in the crate, a gesture that prompted Eliza, a merchant from the north, to place a modest but steady order. The terms were absolute. Quality remained the anchor, and the shipment schedule was the law. But success drew the gaze of the valley's shadow. Silas Whitcomb rode up to the cabin with an offer that tasted like salvation. He laid out a proposal that would solve every one of Clara's immediate miseries: high-grade sugar, infinite glass jars, storage in his climate-controlled warehouse, and priority freight access. He would even pay for the shingles to fix her roof today. The catch was a single, heavy clause. The preserves would carry the Whitcomb label. The original growers' names would be erased, and Silas would dictate the market price to maximize volume. "The one who carries the risk must control the product," Silas argued, his voice smooth and devoid of malice. "That is the only way to ensure profit in a volatile market." Clara stood her ground, her hand resting on the stack of batch logs. "And the one who controls the product must allow others to see the system that produced it," she countered. "I won't trade my ledger for your warehouse." Silas's face hardened. He had no interest in transparency, for transparency revealed the corners he cut. The cost of her refusal was immediate and brutal. The leaks in the roof continued to grow, the rhythm of the dripping water a constant reminder of the money she had just walked away from. Eli stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight, knowing exactly what those shingles would have bought them. Yet, Clara didn't waver. Pressure mounted within days. Suddenly, rubber rings became scarce. Sugar merchants demanded payment in gold up front, and freight drivers found their schedules inexplicably crowded by Whitcomb's priority shipments. Then, the whispers began. Rumors that Clara was using toxic chemicals to force the peach texture. Dr. Caldwell, pressured by the rumors, arrived to perform a public inspection. Clara welcomed him. Transparency didn't make her infallible, but it ensured that if she were to fall, her mistakes would be visible, undeniable, and her own length. The accusation hit Eli like a cold front. Clyde, a warehouse hand, claimed Eli had pilfered rubber rings from the store. The rumor spread through Cottonwood Bend with a lethal efficiency, fueled by everything the town already knew. Eli had no family, no land. He received supplies from Clara, and he had slept in too many doorways to be trusted. Clara found Eli standing on the porch, his posture rigid. He didn't cry or beg for her to believe him. He simply looked at the horizon and asked, "If they've already decided who I am, is the proof even worth the trouble?" Clara didn't offer a platitude. She walked him to the general store and asked Martha to open the ledger. They cross-referenced every delivery hour against the inventory records. The truth wasn't hidden in feeling, but in the math. A supply box had torn during transit, and Clyde had falsified the count to cover his own inventory error. Eli was vindicated by the ink in a book, not by a plea for mercy. Yet innocence was not a shield. The Baxter family, wanting to avoid the stain of scandal, still demanded Eli leave their loft. Being proven right hadn't made him welcome. Clara brought him home, but she didn't just offer a corner of the kitchen. She had transformed the small storage room. There was a fresh bed, a wash basin, a sturdy coat hook, and a low wooden rack for his boots. When Eli walked in, he knelt and placed his mismatched boots neatly on the rack, soles facing inward, the universal sign of someone who intends to stay. Clara didn't mention the move. She simply handed him the cellar thermometer, her signal that he had a tomorrow here. The heat wave arrived not as a storm, but as an erasure. The wind vanished, the nights remained suffocatingly warm, and the well's water level retreated by agonizing inches each morning. Clara started a fresh page in her ledger, her handwriting sharp and disciplined. Day 1-3. Pearl, the cat, moved permanently into the cellar. Clara shifted all heavy labor to the pre-dawn hours, banning any fire-based production after noon. Samuel, seeing the urgency, cut the water to his own parched garden to prioritize the survival of the fruit supply. Day 4-6. The contrast became visible. Kitchen-kept jars began to lose their clarity, the peaches inside shifting to a dull, bruised hue. The cellar samples remained stable. Meanwhile, in the village, Silas Whitcomb ordered his warehouse sealed tight against the swirling dust. Inside, the stagnant, trapped air turned the rubber rings brittle, causing them to lose their grip like overstretched muscle. Martha, seeing this, frantically moved her own supplies to the lowest, dampest point of her cellar. Day 7-8. Water became the valley's most precious currency. Clara dampened the cellar curtains only during the peak solar hours, measuring every drop. News arrived. 2 families had lost their entire winter vegetable stocks as lids failed inside overheated sheds. Dr. Caldwell issued a public warning, urging anyone with unverified jars to discard them. Day 9-10. A yellow string jar in Clara's cellar felt uncharacteristically warm. She didn't wait for evidence of rot. She isolated the entire batch. Across town, the first metallic pop echoed from the Whitcomb warehouse. Silas refused to open the doors, fearing the dry heat would ruin the remaining stock, trapped in his own logic. Day 11. A heavy, sweet stench began to seep from the warehouse cracks. Because Silas had never tracked his batches, his workers were forced to tear down every stack, blind and desperate, searching for the source of the rot. Eli drifted into sleep over the ledger. Clara covered his shoulders with Nate's old apron, leaving him to the quiet room while she sat alone in the cellar's dark, listening for the sound of failure. Day 12. The sky turned a blistering bleached white. The heat refused to break even after sunset. In the warehouse, the failures cascaded. Lids blew off in rhythmic, sickening sequences. In Clara's cellar, the temperature climbed, but the seals held. The yellow batch remained quarantined, a silent testament to her caution. When the white sky finally dimmed, Silas emerged from the warehouse. His boots were stained with sticky, fermenting syrup. He looked toward Clara's cabin, his pride shattered by the smell of his own ruin. He issued a demand for a public inspection, hoping to find a flaw in hers to justify his own catastrophe. He couldn't understand that his warehouse hadn't failed because it was too large. It failed because its scale had allowed small, critical signals to hide in the dark until they became a stench that could no longer be contained. The warehouse was heavy with the silence of 100 onlookers. To ensure fairness, Martha, Frank, Ruth, and Dr. Caldwell acted as the inspecting council. They didn't allow Clara to hand-pick her best jars. They selected samples at random from every category: kitchen-stored, cellar-stored, and a jar that had traveled the dusty freight route to the northern station. Even the isolated yellow string batch was brought out for scrutiny. First, they opened the kitchen control jar. The lid popped with a firm seal, but the contents were a disappointment. The fruit was mushy, its vibrant color dulled by the relentless heat. Dr. Caldwell held it up, his face grim. "A seal is only half the battle," he remarked. "A closed jar in a furnace is still a jar in a furnace." Next, they cracked a cellar jar. The syrup shimmered, clear and light, and the peach slices retained their architectural integrity. Beside it, the travel jar also proved sound. However, when they reached the yellow string batch, Clara stepped forward before anyone could taste it. Though it showed no obvious signs of fermentation, she stopped the inspection. "It differs from the green," she said, her voice steady. "We cannot explain the variance, so we will not sell it." Clara then laid out her sales ledger. Martha cross-referenced the numbers, noting that every single jar accounted for in the log matched the inventory perfectly. No faulty batch had ever reached a customer, and there wasn't a single report of illness. Dr. Caldwell stepped back, his eyes scanning the evidence. "Clara offers no miracles," he told the crowd. "She offers traceability, the discipline to isolate faults, and the humility to be public about her failures. That is how we survive." Ruth Pomeroy, the Valley's oldest authority, nodded once and added, "She has turned the error itself into a map." Silas Whitcomb stood in the back, his sleeves still stained by his own ruin. He didn't offer an apology, but the technical arguments died in his throat. He asked Clara for her terms for the coming season. She didn't hesitate. No exclusivity, no mixing of harvest sources, fair market pricing, and complete transparency in the records. Silas agreed. The name on the jar didn't matter. The system behind it did. The knowledge didn't just sit in Clara's ledger. It bled into the valley. Samuel built his own cellar. Anna successfully processed her first flawless batch. Martha reorganized her stock, and Frank changed how he stacked cargo on his wagon. The community even pooled resources to build a shared, climate-stabilized room at the church to safeguard medicine and seeds. Clara never handed out a single identical blueprint. She taught them to measure their own soil, sun, and slope. Yet, not everything was mended. The majority of the peach harvest remained lost to the canyon winds. Water was still a precious, thinning resource. Many families were still counting pennies before winter, and Clara's roof still leaked every time a storm rolled in. Nate was not coming back, and the hollow ache of his absence remained a part of the cabin's architecture. Eli had grown into his responsibility. He was now instructing an older farmer on how to test a jar's seal, his eyes steady, no longer glancing toward Clara for validation. His boots still sat by the door, always ready, but he moved with the certainty of a boy who had built a foundation beneath his feet. Clara tucked the original receipt for those 7 crates of worthless peaches into the back of her ledger, a reminder that value often hides in the wreckage. As dusk settled over the cabin, Eli looked up from his work. "Can I close the ledger now?" he asked. Clara gazed at the silent rows of jars and the cooling cellar door. "Leave one line for tomorrow," she said. They hadn't conquered the elements, but they had learned to work with their laws. They were not wealthy, but they were ready. What they had preserved was not just the harvest, but the ability to decide their own future.